How's everyone this evening? Good. Thank you so much for coming out in this gray weather, but tonight is the Raptors season opener. We just had the elections, and more importantly, it's Aviva's book launch. So give her a big, big, big round of applause. It's like and I'm delighted to be here. I think it's always great to explore different paths and avenues, especially when it comes to alternatives, especially when it comes to your health. And I've been so enlightened by Aviva's journey. And if you haven't read the book or you want to pick up a book, you can pick them up. They're for sale. They're $20. Yes, they're $20. So you can grab yourself a book and read it, share it with your friends and family. So we're going to get right into the Q&A. Aviva, 2008 was a pivotal year for you. Take us back to the day you were diagnosed. What was going through your mind? And tell us a little bit about the cancer diagnosis.
Well, just to backtrack from 2008, after moving back to Canada from Norway, where I'd been living for a number of years, a friend of mine encouraged me to enroll in the familial breast cancer study at Women's College Hospital because cancer had been in the family. My mother, who's in this audience and is 94, and had cancer in her 60s and has had several recurrences since then, and refused chemotherapy at the time against doctor's orders, and attributes much of her longevity to a substance that is produced by the bees called propolis, which is the bees inject their saliva into the resin of certain trees, and that resin is harvested, and the bees use this to line their nests to keep out parasites and bacteria. And many people who know about this actually take this, and she takes this daily, and it's known to have immune boosting properties. So cancer was in the family, but it was not something I thought about much. I thought maybe in old age I would get cancer. You've got to get something in old age, or hopefully in old age, not before. You're either going to get cancer or heart problems. But I certainly didn't think it in the early 50s. In my early 50s, that would be my fate. Anyway, I was attending my screening appointment, and I remember lying on the hospital table, and the doctor said to the medical student, "I think I feel a thickening, but I think it's nothing," she said. "So let's just send her off to the radiologist and just have an ultrasound and see." So they sent me, and I had a mammogram 2 weeks before, which was negative. So they sent me off for an ultrasound, and the radiologist at the ultrasound said, "I don't think it's anything, but because of the family history, let's just send her off for a biopsy." So they sent me off for a biopsy, and it was extremely painful, and I remember the consternation in the face of the doctor that was doing the biopsy. She was having trouble getting the needle in, I guess because it was a hard lump, which is typical of malignant lumps. But anyway, I left the hospital, joining the busy world outside, didn't think too much about it. And then 2 weeks later, I was in my office seeing a patient, and I got a phone call from the doctor from her cottage. And she was very surprised. She phoned, on her vacation, and she said, "I didn't think it was this, but it was cancer." And I was pretty shocked, and she was kind of shocked as well. So that started a whole lot of hospital visits and second and third opinions in Toronto, in New York, and people seemed to concur that even though it was early stage breast cancer, I should do the surgery, which I thought I was going to do anyway, but that I should also do radiation and chemotherapy. And when something like that happens and you're not prepared, as I feel prepared now, having researched and written this book over the last 8 years, you look to authority figures for the answers. And at that moment, the doctors were the authority figures, and they were doctors who kind of fell more in the conventional line of treatment. And so reluctantly, I agreed to do, I would have done the surgery and I would do it again, but reluctantly I agreed on the surgery and the chemo and the radiation. As many of you may know about chemo, it was discovered during First World War bombing campaigns in southern Italy when people got very ill and also died from decimated white blood cell counts from the bombs. And it was in the 40s that pharmaceutical companies actually picked up this product and began to think about using it in cancer treatment. So the problem with treating cancer with chemo is that the cancer cells often mutate, and they often neutralize the chemo drugs. And actually, in the last year, some very important research came out saying, it was in the New England Journal of Medicine, saying that most early stage cancers, such as the one I had, only in 83% of those cancers, chemo is useless. And as you probably know about chemo, there's a lot of collateral damage. Radiation sits in your bones for life and can give you other cancers, and chemo alters your DNA, and it has a lot of there's a lot of collateral damage with chemo. And they threw the statistics at me when I was trying to decide what to do, and the statistics for chemo at that time, almost 10 years, 11, 12 years ago, were really paltry, but because I was so scared, I just went along with it. You know, it was in the single digits as to whether chemo would make a difference or not. But you kind of grasp at anything when you're in that state. And after the first round of chemo, I landed up back in the ER. They had overdosed me 20%, and I couldn't stop vomiting. And the second round of chemo, I had actually passed out when I was with a patient, seeing a patient, and I was so weak. And so I ended up back in the ER, and they said I should have a CAT scan, and I was too weak to resist. And CAT scans, some people feel, if you have 5 of them over a lifetime, you'll get cancer. So, I guess you've got to pick your poison with all of this. So, anyway, and the other thing that I remember about that time was I remember the nurse sitting next to me as the chemo was coursing through my veins, and he said, I have to sit here because I don't want any of it to drip out of your veins, because it's like putting windshield wiper fluid in your body. And the way I felt and what I increasingly knew about some of the treatments, I began to think it didn't make sense to decimate your immune system even further when it was already ailing. Because you got cancer in the first place, it meant that it wasn't very strong. So I began to wonder and think about ways to actually build up your immune system. And started looking elsewhere for remedies. So that's kind of the backdrop to the writing of the book. It was actually, the writing of the book actually was an outgrowth of the way I felt through this treatment. Really led me to begin to think about looking elsewhere and chronicling what I found elsewhere. So it really planted the seeds for this book. I don't think so.
I know it's fine, it's great. That was my next question, is how this book took shape and why. You obviously had your own personal experiences and you went through some health hardships. But why put it in print and share this? Why was it so important to you?
Well, I was told I would feel better after 6 months, and it actually took me 4 years and a lot of work on myself outside of mainstream medicine to start to feel better. And as I was just saying, I felt that I never wanted to go through that again, and I was really on a journey myself to make sure that I got back to health and stayed healthy, because I didn't want that to go through that grueling treatment. And I came to realize that actually cancer is not something you can cut out and forget about. And I guess I feel annoyed when I hear people say, oh, so-and-so has cancer, he had it 2 years ago, and he had treatment and he's fine. Because it's really not like that with cancer. It's more of a management issue, it's a systemic problem, it's a whole body issue, and you have to deal with it in that way. And that's what this book is really about. The book is really about It's a journey that I took interviewing a lot of professionals across the spectrum who look at the treatment and management of cancer in many different ways from different angles. It needs to be regarded as something whose soil needs to be changed. The soil that the cancer grew in the first place needs to be altered. And that's really how I approach this book. How do we alter the soil that the cancer grows in? Whether you've already had cancer or even if you haven't had cancer, how can you prepare the soil in your body so that no cancer cells will get out of control, such as they did in my case and in many other cases of women in the world. Much of what I've written in the book is backed up by scientific research. A lot of what's presented in the book was not presented to me, at least, and I think to most women when they're diagnosed with breast cancer. It's a book about options. I'm not saying you should do this or do that or follow this course. I know what I would do if it happened again. The writing of the book took me from Toronto to Hong Kong, where I interviewed a man in Hong Kong that Dr. Huey in Toronto, who's an integrative physician, put me onto, who had a miraculous recovery after being written off by the traditional healthcare system in Hong Kong. He had colon cancer, end stage, and had spread to his liver. And he then, as a last-ditch thing, went to be treated by a Dr. Ma, a Chinese traditional doctor in Hong Kong, who has his own way of working with patients that is much gentler to the system. I actually consulted with Dr. Ma. I was there for a conference. I didn't have a full treatment with him, but my neck was out of alignment, and he got my neck back in place immediately. And so that's where I would go if it happened to me again. I would go and see Dr. Ma in Hong Kong.
One of the things you just mentioned was it was really important for you to get healthy. How did you specifically nurse yourself back to health and stay healthy? Like, what are some of those specifics for you?
Well, there are simple things like plant-based diet. I altered my diet was, I thought, good before, but it wasn't good enough, I guess. There are many things in our diet that we don't even think about that generate inflammation in the body, and inflammation can generate tumors. Sugar feeds cancer. For instance, before I had my surgery, they injected a sugar dye into my breast, into the lymphatic system, because the dye, when it meets a tumor, the tumor just sucks up the sugar. So that's a scientific fact. That cancer loves sugar. Certain foods generate inflammation, like white flour. Dairy and red meat are acidifying. Cancer doesn't grow in an acid environment. I supplemented with, and still do, with a lot of supplements, D3, things that clear out your liver. You can, in estrogen-positive cancers, which are very common in many women with breast cancer, you can get an overload of the bad estrogen in your liver, and there are ways of clearing out your liver and clearing out the bad estrogen. So you have to be mindful of that all the time. Dr. Peddle will talk about hormones because they have a role with that. Myomins, Dr. Peddle put me on myomins in lieu of tamoxifen and aromatase inhibitors. It doesn't have any collateral effects, and it rids your liver of the bad estrogen. I take 20 milligrams of melatonin every night. That rolls back your biological clock and strengthens the immune system in doing so. I regularly monitor my bloods with things that the regular doctors don't check for. You can check for inflammation in the blood, for blood stickiness, blood clotting. There's a fabulous test that my naturopath suggested I have initially, which is called the ion profile test. It's a very expensive test, but it's worth doing. If your doctor ever tells you that whatever symptoms you're complaining about are nothing, but you're not feeling good, and you have these symptoms, it's a test that I suggest you look into. It's not offered by mainstream doctors. It's called the ion profile test. It costs about $800. Goes off to the States. but it comes back to 20 pages about your metabolic and nutritional status. So it's a really great test. Biological dentistry, there is a fantastic biological dentist in the audience, Dana Colson. I don't know where, Dana, you're at the back, who contributed to the book. I love mentioning dentistry because it's something that most people don't know about in relation to illness. My naturopath initially told me to deal with my teeth immediately, get all my amalgam fillings out. Amalgam is 50% mercury and it off-gases in your mouth for life. It's those silver things in your mouth. Root canals, for instance, root canals can be chronically infected. They're very controversial. Many dentists believe that you can't properly clear out the infection. Bacteria from the mouth has been found in pancreatic cancer and also in Alzheimer's patients' brains. So the mouth is the gateway to the rest of the body, and if you have things going on in your mouth, it can contribute to organ problems in other places. So yeah, that's some of what I did.
It's very, very interesting, especially considering what we're often fed in conventional media in terms of remedies and methods to deal with different cancers. But I know this was a personal experience for you related to breast cancer. Would you apply this to perhaps other cancers or any other type of illness that other people are dealing with?
Yeah, the same inflammatory process that generates a tumor in the breast can also generate tumors in other parts of the body. So all of these things, diet, supplementation, and so on, hormonal interventions, can help to prevent other cancers. In the book, Dr. Huey actually told me several stories about practitioners in other parts of the world. For instance, there was a Dr. Nowicki in Ukraine who moved to Austria, who successfully treated pancreatic cancer for many years. And Dr. Huey in Toronto got the product from his factory in Austria, and he said it was like a miracle drug with pancreatic cancer. It reversed it. And if you look on the website of Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York, you'll actually see a reference to this product that Dr. Nowicki used, which was derived from a plant called the great celandine flower, and the product is called Ukraine. So I don't know if you can get hold of it at this time, but it was used and very successfully. It killed only the cancer cells and didn't do the damage to the other cells. And then there is also Dr. Debella in Italy, for instance. There are many articles written about his work, quite controversial, but he put all of his cancer patients on 20 milligrams of melatonin every night because he felt and noticed that this was a good cancer prevention. So melatonin is an easy thing that you can do, and Dr. Huey actually thought that everybody over 50 should be on melatonin anyway because it gets depleted as you get older, and it's an important hormone.
Now, in relatability to the title of your book, If Only I Had Known, if this was to happen now, today, if you were to be diagnosed again, what would you do differently?
I would do the surgery again. Some people believe that the actual surgery can spread malignant cells around. But still, I personally feel it's probably better to do it. One thing I did learn in writing this book was from a patient that I interviewed was that if you're young and you have a lot of hormones swirling around, you can also time your surgery to your best advantage so that your estrogen levels are low and your progesterone, which is anti-estrogen, is high. I didn't know about that when I had surgery the first time, but that is something important that people can do if they still have a lot of hormones swirling around. As I said earlier, I think I would go to Hong Kong and be treated by Dr. Ma, who has his own. It was a fascinating experience going into his office, his whole setup there, which is locked. You can't just walk in off the street. There are all these people in sort of uniforms weighing different herbs, and people being wheeled in, and some of them had needles coming out, acupuncture needles coming out of their chins, and everything happened out in the open on these gurneys. And one of the first things he believes needs to be done is to get your neck in alignment, because the oxygen, he believes that illness is caused by poor oxygen supply in the blood to the brain. So he sent me downstairs for an x-ray, which cost $15. It was an old-fashioned kind of machine, where they put a bib on you, and the x-ray was produced in 5 minutes, and then somebody worked on my neck, because I'd injured my neck in a yoga class. So these are kind of simple interventions that he uses, but that obviously for many people have great effect. So that's where I would go.
We're going to, I think, open it up to Dr. Alvin Peddle as well, so he can say some words. Thank you so much. We wanted to continue talking and continue this Q&A for a while, but then we'd give away the whole book. So we encourage all of you to read it. And Dr. Alvin Peddle is going to come to the mic and say some words. And I'm really excited because I only spoke to him for a few minutes earlier on. And now I feel like I'm going to book a 5-hour session or a coffee date with him so I can pick his brain. But please give a round of applause to Dr. Alvin Peddle.
Can you hear me? Thank you. Can you hear me? Well, there's not much more that I would say or ever say about the diagnosis and treatment. However, what there are doctors in this room as well. What is not known by doctors, myself included when I graduated, was that there's not one estrogen, there's 3 estrogen. When males in this room were inside the uterus, why weren't we feminized? If estrogen causes feminization, why weren't we? I was never taught that. It's because estriol is the only hormone of pregnancy, and progesterone. And who has the least of all breast cancer? People who have had the most pregnancy. So progesterone and estriol are actually protected. In 1990, Lemon and Fothergill gave estriol, an estrogen, to a cancer-ridden, I think it was close to 80 patients who were sent home to die of breast cancer at secondary to their bone. And they gave them estriol. Can you imagine today giving a patient with estrogen-positive cancer an estrogen? They would take their license away. But in fact, 47% of those patients went into total remission. That's because the receptors that were receiving positive data, estrogens such as estriol, blocked the bad estrogens from getting to the cancer. Now, no one paid attention to this study. Lemon and Fothergill did this study in 1990. It was the same year as, I think, cancer treatment was started with chemo, with radiation. So it just was never even noticed. But today, after practicing for 50 years, the answer really is in prevention. We have a lot to learn about how to prevent cancer of all kinds. Diet. Hippocrates says you are what you eat. 1 glass of milk has 350 milligrams of estrone, the very worst estrogen of the 3. So we, in fact, have to even look at what we're eating. Whether the cow is eating a natural diet of grass-fed is still a big animal, female, and we're expected to believe that's good for us. It's not. When I graduated from medical school, I was told Premarin, progesterone, and Provera, not progesterone, was the way to treat cancer, the way to treat menopause, hormones. And we bought it, all the doctors in this room. And it was totally 100% wrong. You cannot swallow estrogen without having side effects. The best thing you can do is give your transdermal hormones to patients and give them the best. Give them the 2 estriol and estradiol, not estrone. I didn't know that when I graduated medical school. But I began to learn it myself in 1994, after I took 6 months off to find, I guess it was my place in this world. And that's because I lost my own mother with breast cancer. And I think having that in my history, I think that it made me feel that being an obstetrician gynecologist, I had to do something. And so I left for 6 months. I left for 6 months medicine, and I was the chief of OBS and gynae. I had to find the answer because my patients were telling me they were fat, they were bleeding, they had breast pain, and every one of them told me that horse's urine can't possibly be right for them, and I believed them. So I did my research. It took me many, many years, and I took on a lot of allopathic doctors when I told them that the mistake they had made was they had given Provera, a synthetic progestin, which does the absolute opposite of real progesterone, as you said, in the body. It does the absolute opposite. They did an experiment where they took monkeys and gave them hysterectomies. They gave one group of monkeys a vasospastic drug. They gave the other group of monkeys a vasospastic drug. And the only difference between giving the hormones, they gave Premarin, which they shouldn't have, but they gave Provera, synthetic, to one group, and they gave real progesterone cream to the other group. The entire group of monkeys that were given Provera had to be given a reversing drug before they all had a heart attack. But not one of the monkeys, given the vasoconstriction that they got, the other group, needed any drugs to stop a heart attack. So vasodilatation comes from natural progesterone. Vasoconstriction comes from Provera. Here we were giving it to patients in the age that they get heart attacks. Once estrogen goes through the liver, first pass through the liver, nothing good happens at all. So once again, if you've got options, take estrogen. Make sure the estrogen is not estrone. If you can understand that there's 3 estrogens, once again, estrone is the worst one. Estradiol, kind of both alphas, but 10%, and then 80% is estriol. So if your urine contains estriol, you're safe for breast cancer. So how can we find out which people in this room have a high risk of breast cancer? Well, we can actually measure E1, E2, and E3. If we collect urine from a woman, we can actually see the ratio called the EQ. Anything greater than 1, take the safe estrogen, E3, and divide it by the 2 bad estrogens, E1 and E2. And if the number is greater than 1, they have a very small chance of breast cancer. I can show you pictures later on. I have in my pocket of a patient who started off very high risk, but after treatment, blocking the pathway to estrone and also giving her proper progesterone, that her pathway had cleaned up. You mentioned soil. So prevention in my office talks about paying your dues. Diet, exercise, water, and sleep. Okay, and those are the 4 things, paying your dues. So Hippocrates says you are what you eat. You can give a raw fish to an Eskimo and nothing happens. You can give a raw fish to an Asian and they'll get stomach cancer. So each one of us have different genes. I lost my mother because of the BRCA gene, so it wasn't necessarily because of estrogen. But I knew that it was on her left breast, even though I was a kid. When I walked into the house at 10 to hear my mother crying, she was crying, not because she had breast cancer, she was to get that later on. Because my younger brother had died, he was a Mongoloid child, and it was the first time I'd ever seen my mother cry. And I knew that when my mother died at the age of 59, cancer at the age of 48, that it had to be on the left side. She died of a broken heart. And I believe that that's when her cancer started. So I agree that an environment is absolutely necessary to prevent cancer. If you have an adverse environment, you can have an Italian family around the table Friday night, having a great time, eating, enjoying themselves. Take that one male